Another run of people speaking about city planning, specifically about London, and in a way we're continuing in the same vein, but broadening things a little to speak not just of London, but of cities in general. And our speaker, Tim Gill, is going to speak on child-friendly urban planning and design.
Thank you very much, Alison. How's the audio? Good? Great. And thank you very much to Islington Iu3a for the invitation. A special thanks to Anne Wayman, who initially approached me. Anne and I go back longer than either of us might care to remember, but certainly, I would say the mid-90s, when I was at the National Children's Bureau. And I've been working for about 30 years or more on flying the flag for children's everyday freedoms and making a case for why we need to make it easy for children to get out, play, to get around the neighbourhoods, and easy for parents to let that happen. And so that's what I'll be talking about. And when we're thinking about children, and I often find this as a writer and a speaker, one of the advantages I have is that I'm going to take a wild guess and say that most of you were once children. And so we all have a kind of reservoir of experience to draw on. And I'm going to invite you to do that right now. I want you to think about the kind of places that you used to play when you were a child. Okay, I'm going to let that prompt drift around in your head for a couple of seconds, 5 or 10 seconds, and I'm going to invite you to think about your favourite place to play when you were young. Okay, your favourite place to play when you were a child. And now I want you to turn to the person next to you, or if it's a three, it doesn't really matter, and just share with them briefly a description of that place. So where was that place, your favourite place to play when you were a child? And I'm going to give you about 1 minute and 37 seconds to do that, and then we'll do some quick feedback afterwards. Okay? Is that all clear? So, your favourite place to play when you were a child? Off you go. Okay, so time's up. So I'm going to ask you 2 questions. Okay, so in each case I want you to put your hands up if the answer to the question is yes. So the first question, hands up please if your favourite place to play was out of doors. Okay, I think that's not quite unanimous, but we get the picture. Second question, hands up please if your favourite place to play was somewhere that was not directly supervised by adults. Okay, I think possibly even a little bit more on that occasion. I had a hunch what the answer to those two questions were, but let's just pull that out. So this audience, your favourite places to play were places that were out of doors and more or less out of sight of adults. That is not unusual. Even with a much younger demographic, that is not unusual. If we had more time, I could explore what some of those places were. I'm going to guess you talked about maybe scraps of land near where you lived, woods, streams, maybe if you were lucky enough to live near the coast, grow up near the coast, beach, or maybe you talked about building sites, railway lines, trees would probably have featured regardless, maybe corners of your back garden, maybe you talked about the street. Now, the reason I do that exercise, and as I say, the answers are almost universally the same. The reason I do that exercise is not because there was some golden age to grow up, or that today's children, don't have this and so they're going to go to hell in a handcart. The reason I do that is that I want you to reconnect with what it's like to be a child, to remind yourself of something of childhood. And that one of the things that's remarkable about the young of our species is our appetite for experience, for adventure and for exploration. We want to get to grips with the people and places around us as we grow up. Figure out how things work, what's out there. And yes, sometimes to take some risks, do some things that may be a bit stupid. And that characteristic of the young of our species is just as strong today as it has ever been. But some things have changed. And my next slide takes that on, beside how childhood has been changing over recent decades. So what you're looking at is a map, and it maps out what you might call the roaming range, or the kind of home territory of 4 children. They're all aged 8 years old, but they're in 4 generations of the same family, and they all grew up in the same city. So the big blob that you can see that takes up most of the map, that's the home territory of the great-grandfather in this family at the age of 8. He could go 6 miles across the city on his own. Then you can see how the circles shrink with each generation until you can see the yellow dot here at the top left. That's the home territory of the son. If you can't read that, he's actually allowed to walk a couple of hundred metres to the end of his street. Okay? So what this illustrates is what I call the shrinking horizons of childhood. And it's, I think, one of the most important and one of the most still under-recognised changes in children's lives. And what gets me out of bed in the mornings and doing what I do is reflecting on and responding to this change. And yes, this is just one family, but I'm guessing many of you will be aware from your own family and friends, this is an almost universal pattern. We see this with girls and boys, all social classes, cultural groups. It's a pattern that's unfolding around the world. So, when we think about that, and then we think about sort of children's gradual expansion of their agency, that one of the things that hopefully goes on as children grow up is they gradually get not just a sense of their own agency, but they gradually become more responsible for their everyday decisions, where they go, who they're with, what they can do. So that childhood, if you like, is a kind of journey, and central to that journey is the gradual, or should be, the gradual transfer of responsibility from adults to children. Because of course when children are very young, they're entirely dependent on adults for their most basic needs. And so, if we think about this journey, and we think about that appetite for experience that we see in children, then we ask ourselves, how do towns and cities typically cater for that? How do we in what ways are cities and towns designed to be able to go with the grain of these features of children? And in other words, when we think about town planning and design, where do you see evidence of thinking about children? And typically, that's what you see. Okay. This is a particularly dismal example, but it's not, and actually it's contemptuous, isn't it? I mean, I hope we would agree, this is an insult, but it's not just this particular example I want you to realise. It's the model I want you to see. Okay, what is the model? The model is that our job with children is to create reservations and to put things that will occupy them inside those reservations. And I'm going to suggest to you that is absolutely the wrong model when we think about towns and cities and children. And I'm going to offer you a different one. So, here's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to say a bit more about what I think child-friendly urban planning and design is, why I think it matters, not just to children, but especially to children. A bit of a flavour of what's happening here in the UK, and in particular here in London, and then brief thoughts on making this happen, making more places work better for children. So, my evidence base is quite a lot of what I'm going to share with you is drawn from some studies of actual cities that have taken children's views and needs seriously. I was lucky enough to get a Churchill Fellowship a few years ago, which enabled me to travel to spend time in about a dozen cities in Europe and North America, and then a bit more funding from a charity to go to a couple more cities in South America and to Tel Aviv in Israel. And so these are all cities that have invested time and money and political capital into making their built form more child-friendly. And you can see a list of them there, and it's a mix of cities in different parts of the world with different scales and sizes and climates, and so I can be reasonably confident, I think, that what I'm going to be sharing with you is quite widely applicable in many of the places where children live, here in London, in the UK and beyond. Okay. What is child-friendly urban planning? Well, let's start with thinking about what makes a neighbourhood work well for families generally. Okay, what are families, what are the components that make a place work for families? First of all, housing. Okay, if you don't have housing that works for families, you won't have families living in an area. Secondly, we need services, of course, schools, childcare, relevant health services and so on. But the third platform, right, the third leg that makes a neighbourhood family-friendly is what planners call the public realm: parks, streets, open spaces. Now, you might get families moving to a neighbourhood that doesn't have very nice or has unsafe public realm, but they won't stay. And you see this in lots of towns and cities, where there are welcoming, convivial places for families will move out. And it's this third plank that I'm interested in. Mainly because I think it's only when children kind of enter the public realm, when they start to live their lives beyond their homes, beyond the institutions of their lives, schools, whatever. It's only then that children start properly on that journey to being independent people. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in on this sort of public realm, and I'm going to offer you and show you the single most important graphic from my book. I should have given a plug to my book, and so this is all from my book, Urban Playground. I have lots of copies at the back. I'd like to be leaving at the end of this event with rather fewer copies. And it came out a few years ago. It's published by the Royal Institute of British Architects, and it was their bestseller for 2021, which I'm quite proud But anyway, this is the most important diagram in that book, and it shows you a framework for a child-friendly place. Okay, so you can see a child-friendly place, first of all, is indeed a place where there's lots of choice. There's lots of things to do. There's different types of places where children can spend time and meet their friends. There's contact with nature, sports, recreation, culture. So choice and variety, that's one axis, one dimension of this framework, but that's not enough on its own. The second dimension is children's mobility. How easy is it for children to get around a neighbourhood? Crucially, to get around under their own steam, where they don't have to rely on the parental taxi service. Okay? So it's only, a neighbourhood is child-friendly in physical terms, only when it scores highly on both choice and variety and ease of getting around. Crucially, getting around on foot or by bike. Newsflash, children can't drive. So, and in fact, if you think about the kind of places that we all like to go to on our holidays, this is where we're going, right? And families are the same. So, I could almost stop talking here because almost everything else I say from now on is going to be drawing out the implications of this framework. But I promised you to talk. I promised Anne anyway, I'll talk for 45 minutes, so I'm going to carry on. And I'm going to give you an illustration of one neighbourhood that I think exemplifies these properties. In my book, I suggest provocatively that it's the ultimate child-friendly neighbourhood. It's called Vauban, and it's a district in the German city of Freiburg, south of Germany. And you can see an area of the district here. It's got about 6,000 population. It's apartment living. It's very green, but this is not unlike quite a lot of mainland European residential areas. But what marks Vauban out from many other districts is that at ground level, it's more or less entirely car-free. Okay? So, and you can see a hint of that in the photo on the right. Now, you can own a car if you live in Vauban, but not many families do, for reasons that will become clear. If you do own a car, you have to park it not outside your house, but in one of a number of, let's call them car barns, yeah? Big car parks on the edge of the development. And what that means is, not only are the streets more or less entirely traffic-free, but all of that space that in many neighbourhoods is taken up by parked cars sitting, not moving for 97% of their week, all of that space is available for different uses, for parks, social space, squares. So let's have a little bit more of a look. One of the interesting things about Vauban is that there aren't many playgrounds. There are lots of features that children can play on, there's lots of green space, but more often than not you see something like this here, where you have a kind of playful offer, a slide, but it's in a wider park. It's not fenced off and segregated. And here's a couple more examples of the squares. This is a slightly bigger park. This is a cold afternoon weekday in March. It's the last time I visited Freiburg in 2018. And you can see it's full of children and families. This is one of the kind of hangout square. It's actually not very full of people because it's boiling hot. This was on my first visit in 2006. But if you look very closely, you can see there's a couple of items of clothing that have been left. Not only showing you that this place is well used, but also that it's relatively safe. People not worried about leaving their property. So it's a bit of a flavour of some of the public realm. The streets are, as you would expect, almost entirely free of cars, which means not just moving cars but parked cars, which means that they're very lively. that local trips, or indeed just social interactions, play, unfolds in these streets to a far greater extent than they would do otherwise. And it's remarkable. So Freiburg is, Vauban is sometimes called an eco-suburb. So it was developed as a kind of model sustainable development. So there's all sorts of other things I can talk about. In fact, my next slide shows one of them. This is one of those car barns that I talked about, which also has lots of solar panels on the top. And you can see the tram. So that one of the first things that was put into the development when it was built in the 90s was an efficient, regular tram service to the rest of the city, which of course reduces the demand and the need for car ownership in the first place. So many planners and designers have beaten a path to Vauban over the decades from all over the world to see this flagship eco-suburb. And one of the things that you always see when they write up their findings is they cannot believe how many children they see out, accompanied and unaccompanied, in the district. I'll come back to that in a minute. So in my book I sort of offer it's like a schematic, a kind of diagram that tries to pull out some of the key elements. I'm not going to talk to all of these elements, but what's going on here is effectively there's kind of two layers. The first layer is sort of environmentally sustainable planning. So it's reasonably high density, green, compact, mixed uses. So you haven't got all of the jobs or all of the retail over somewhere else, which again would almost compel people to use a car. So this is a fairly standard eco-district model. But then the second layer is explicitly thinking about children. Lots of places, lots of facilities, lots of public space. The school is at the heart of the neighbourhood, easier to get to, but also the playground in the school is open outside of school hours, so children can go anytime they like and use the facilities. There's a plaza where teenagers can hang out. So that's a kind of idealised version of the kind of district I'm talking about. It's not the only model, and we could discuss. It's a provocation. Right? It's a kind of lighthouse or a compass point that I'm offering in the book, and that's what I want to kind of leave you with as a kind of picture in your head. So that's what child-friendly planning is. Why does it matter? Now, as I said, I went to about a dozen cities. And these are all cities where the city leaders, the mayors, senior politicians, all thought this sort of idea mattered. So I was really interested to find out from them, why are you spending time, money, local tax money on making neighbours look more like this? And in simple terms, the answer I got from city leaders fell into three broad headings. A bunch of cities talked about children explicitly. We are doing this because we can see that children will be happier and healthier. Oh, and also we care about children's rights, and we want to bring children into the conversations about what neighbourhoods and cities should be like. So that's the first group. There's a second group of cities that talked about sustainability, and in case it's not obvious, it should be obvious from what I've just said about Vauban. If we ask ourselves, what does a sustainable neighbourhood or a sustainable city look like? Well, it looks a lot like a child-friendly city. It's compact, it's green, it's easy to get around on foot or by car. And then there's a third group of cities, in a way they're the most interesting, who talked about more hard-nosed economic and demographic facts and factors. So these are cities that essentially what they had done, they had grasped this insight about a city, which is that a city that is not able to attract and retain families is a city whose long-term future is pretty bleak, right? And actually that's a very pertinent topic here in London right now, where we're seeing families moving out of especially inner London. So where are the next cohort of nurses, teachers, people working in shops? Where are those people going to be living? And are they even going to be able to get into the city? Or let alone have any hope of living near where they work? So here's the takeaway, and the reason why I did this as a Venn diagram. Many cities, most of the cities I spoke to, they're in the overlaps, yeah? They're making connections, they're joining the dots between those three broad headings. And that's the takeaway from this, that there's clear links between making places child-friendly, making them more sustainable, and making them have a long-term future. So, when I'm speaking to city leaders, I'm not saying to them, oh, I know you've got lots of other priorities, but here's a new one that I want you to think about. I'm saying to them, if you care about making your city more sustainable and more attractive to families, you should be thinking about children. But I'm going to unpack this section a little bit more and talk about some of these three headings in a little bit more detail. I'm now consider myself a lifelong Londoner. I actually moved to London when I was 23, quite a few years ago now. But I love this city. But there are some things about the city I'm not proud of. And one of them, and you may know this story, is that London is now a city where we can see that air pollution is actually killing children. And this is Deborah, who became the first child. She died from lung disease, and her home was about 50 metres away from the South Circular. And on the coroner's report, air pollution was stated as a factor in her death, and it's the first time that happened in a cause of death report. And I hope you are as distressed as I am about that finding. But the truth is actually that child-unfriendly neighbourhoods have been harming children for decades. And in fact, the topic I'm most concerned to focus on in terms of child health is actually road danger. Right now, road danger, so cars and drivers, are killing more children and young adults around the world than any other single cause. Any other single cause. The only reason not the only reason, the main reason it's low in some parts of the world is, actually, remember that map I showed you back, the shrinking horizons of childhood? We don't see children out and about in streets to anything like the same extent. We don't see children playing in the street. But still, here in the UK, right now, 1 in 10 of the deaths of 14-year-olds, 1 in 10 of those deaths is car-related. That's both passengers and pedestrians. Somewhere between 30 and 50 children a year in the UK die from being hit by drivers, either walking or biking. And I think it's, again, a source of shame, not just, by the way, this is true in many countries, that we kind of try to forget this fact. You know, it's an epidemic that's in plain sight. I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but I will just say, I reckon that more children died from car crashes during the COVID epidemic than died from COVID. So I hope that puts this in some sort of perspective. And this cause of death, and of course for every death there's probably 10 children who have life-changing injuries. Poorer children in poorer neighbourhoods are far more likely to be affected. So it's hugely unfair. Okay, I'm going to move to a more positive note now. Outdoor play. As Anne will know, outdoor play was and promoting outdoor play has been kind of run through my work like a stick of rock for 30 years, and it is really good for kids to play outside, and we know much more about how good it is than we used to, in all sorts of ways, for their bodies, for their hearts, for their spirits, and for their minds. And there's a whole heap of research that I won't go to in any detail. But one thing that is quite interesting, I think, is the children who can get around on their own in their neighbourhoods have a greater sense of what their neighbourhoods are like and feel more connected to the neighbourhoods than children who don't. These are two drawings done by two different children in the same class, actually in a school in Australia. The drawing on the left was done by a child who walked to school. So it's quite nice, actually shows you deep understanding, a rich feel for what their neighbourhood is like. And the drawing on the right was done by a child who was driven to school. It's a tree, a house, a park. No sense of how these things fit together or what their connection is with them. Turning briefly to that topic of the economy and demographics, this is a quote I use from Roger Maidlin, and maybe you recognise, does anyone recognise this space? Granary Square in King's Cross. One of the schemes that I worked on a long time ago, but Granary Square is, it becomes that area's beachfront. It doesn't even need to be that sunny, actually. And Roger Maidlin, who was the lead developer, realised that is a better marker of the success of that place than almost anything else he could wish for. And so, there is an economic rationale for making places attractive for children and families. And I don't want to forget children themselves. Children make up at least 20% of any given population. They have no vote. They have no formal ability in almost all contexts to make their views and feelings known. But when we do ask children what they think, what they like and what they don't like about where they live, their answers match very closely to that framework that I talked about. They like choice and variety of places to go and things to do. They don't like traffic and run-down places. Okay, one more piece of audience interaction, and maybe you're thinking this for a while. Yeah, but kids today, are they the same? The digital world is so much more prominent in children's lives. It is, so on. You to think about this statement, and I'm not going to ask you to chat on it, just have a guess. Okay, if we gave children today a choice, right, you've got some free time, what would you like to do with that free time? Would you like to be online playing? Would you like to be playing outdoors? Would you like to be meeting your friends in real life? And have a think about which of those, basically those three options: online, playing out, being with friends. Okay? I will share with you, this is a representative survey. Around 40% of children, given those choices, want to see their friends face to face. Around 25 to 30 want to play out. Around 10 to 15% want to spend more time on their screens. Okay, so if you add these two together, for every one child who wants to be on their screens for longer, there's 6 or 7 or 8 children who want to be outdoors. Okay, so let's not kid ourselves that children are happy about the time they're spending online. Yes, the digital world is important to children. It's important to children because mainly they no longer have the same opportunity to hang out, play, be with their friends IRL, in real life, that previous generations of children have had. And I cannot overemphasise the importance of this. It's a way of dodging the issue if we just say to ourselves, oh, kids today, they don't care about being outdoors. And I don't know how many of you have been following the debate about children's mental health and the consequences of large amounts of time spent on, particularly on social media. I'm not going to dive into that too much, but having had some contact with Jonathan Haidt, whose book came out earlier this year, it caused a huge stir. I am absolutely with him when he says, okay, there may be some issues around the time children are spending online, but we need to bring play into children's lives, to create time for them to feel a sense of their own agency, to figure out how to get along, to overcome challenges, to figure out disputes and not catastrophize when the first slightest thing goes wrong. And we need to change the societal constraints that stop that from happening. And one of the biggest societal constraints is what children and families see when they look out of their front doors. Okay. Here's a quote I want you to take away with you. So this is the former mayor of Bogota, capital city of Colombia, Enrique Peñalosa. So I'm lucky enough to meet him. He's quite a character. And he, with his team, transformed that city in the 90s and the noughties. It was the murder capital of the world. It was trashed, and over several administrations, he's made it into a civilized, well-functioning and attractive city. It's not perfect, but again, I've been lucky enough to visit that city twice, and the transformation is unbelievable. And he says children are a kind of indicator species. They're like the canary in the coal mine. And he goes on, if we can build a successful city for children, we'll have a successful city for all people. And actually, I take this metaphor quite seriously. And remember the district that I described to you earlier, Vauban. I said that many visitors to Vauban remarked on, were surprised by the numbers of children, the sheer numbers of children of different ages, with and without their parents, out and about. And I think that that's a sign of the health of the human habitat in exactly the same way that if you see salmon swimming in a river, it's a sign of the health of that habitat. So that's why child-friendly planning matters. What's happening here in the UK? I'm going to briefly point out that we now live in a country of 4 nations. I'm not going to talk about Wales and Scotland, but if I did, I would tell you there's actually quite a lot of policy and practice happening in those parts of the world that's leaving England behind. I'm working on that. But I'm going to talk a bit about London and a little bit about another part of England as well. So in London, we actually have, unusually for a big city, possibly uniquely for a big city, policy to try and create more child-friendly places. It's in the London Plan, which, as you probably know, is the strategic planning document for London, and there's big policy which I'll share in a bit more detail later. We also have an agenda-setting publication, at least 2 London boroughs, sadly not Islington yet, but Hackney and Tower Hamlets both have guidance and policy, and there is an interesting historic scheme in Islington, which I'll talk about, in EC1, in South Islington. So, the London Plan has a policy on children's play and recreation, and at the heart of that policy is a requirement that new developments where families will live should create 10 square metres of space for play per child. Now there's a whole story about how you unpack that, but the crucial insight here is that new residential areas should provide playable space, not necessarily a fenced-off playground with bits of ironmongery in it, but space where children can play. It should be at the street level, it should have some greenery, it should not be segregated by tenure, that's important, it should be connected, and so on. So that is firm policy, and any developer should, if they're not going to meet every aspect of that, they're going to have a very good story to tell to the mayor for their planning proposal. Hackney has similar planning guidance and also has clearly and demonstrably introduced schemes. Low traffic neighbourhoods, we could maybe talk about those later, I know they're contentious, but I hope you can see that low traffic neighbourhoods do indeed create more opportunities for walking and biking and reduce the level of danger from cars, and we can see that from the studies. Also school streets, I'll say a bit more about those later. Investment in parks in Hackney, and some attractive regeneration and new housing schemes I'm going to show you brief picture of King's Crescent. This is just opposite Clissold Park in Hackney, and it's really nice and quite provocative. This is actually a former street at the front of the new office accommodation that's been turned into a kind of linear play park, and there's also play features inside each of the 3 courtyards, but they're not playgrounds. In fact, in one case, there's a synthesis between play facilities and allotment space, and it works pretty well. Is everybody entirely happy in that development that children are playing in their courtyard? No, because, newsflash, children can sometimes be irritating. They sometimes make a noise. That's one of the things that communities have to figure out, and they might need some help in doing that. But if you go into a scheme like this and you say one of your requirements is that no adult will ever be irritated by a child, well, I think we know where that's going to end up. The Olympic Park, again, I've been proud to work on the Olympic Park scheme. All sorts of good things to say about it, but the takeaway from here is that it's got a very well thought through hierarchy of different types of public space. Set-piece playgrounds, green space, squares that make that part of London a place where you can always, as a family, no matter what your children's interest or inclination or age, find somewhere in your patch where they can go and spend time. There's a couple of photos, and there's some more. It's really well worth, if you feel inclined to see what England's doing, what London's doing, having a wander around the residential areas of the Olympic Park. I'm actually going to skip my next section because time is pressing on, but I do want to talk a bit, I do want to talk about South Islington. So, people who've lived in Islington a long time may know that South Islington, around, so north of Old Street, got huge amounts of government funding back in the Labour government years. So this is the New Deal for Communities programme, which was allegedly targeted at the worst estates. It's not a very friendly term, but in South Islington, it was unique amongst the 39 ND schemes in that there was a significant investment in public space. And all sorts of good things happened in Islington. You can still see them today. Sparfields Park, I mean, some of these are pretty old now, as you can imagine, sort of 15, maybe even 20 years old. So I last visited, I think, about 6 months ago. Regularly, I give tours walking around South Islington. And some of these could do with a bit of a refresh, but still, Sparfields doing a good job as a local park, King Square Gardens, road closures. There's a whole menu, a recipe of interventions in that part of Islington. Reconfiguring traffic circulation, taking out parking, improving housing, amenity spaces. Now, in this case, the programme wasn't badged as a child-friendly programme. It had wider goals, but the person who led the programme and the people who were behind it knew that a focus on children and families would be helpful. So amongst other things, it had its own play strategy and policy. And I can still take people to parts of that part of Islington and see how these changes are working well for the people who live there. I didn't want to just talk about London, so I said briefly Cambridge is probably the other part of England where there's some significant schemes going on that have a child-friendly element. And one of the significant things about Cambridge is that it has a pretty well-resourced and strategic planning body, and has done for some years, and that really a bit like London, makes a difference. So this is Great Knighton, which is just south of the main part of the centre of Cambridge. I mean, that image, I think many people will be surprised at seeing that in a non-metropolitan context in England. It looks more like something I'd expect to see in Vienna or indeed Freiburg. It's a nice image. this is what we call a play trace. Okay? When you see chalk on a pavement, you know that children have procreated and are enjoying that patch of their neighbourhood. This is a photo I took a few months ago. So behind my back is the school, the local primary school. So there's a big space out front. There actually is a road, but it's just one lane, so traffic is very slow through that street and one way. And then just over is a very attractive park space. Here is a Trumping Meadows just around the corner in Cambridge. Traffic-free pedestrian street with it's actually a kind of springy bench. That's a nice little play for the feature. North Stowe, big new development to the north of Cambridge, whole new town that's growing up. What's nice about this play space, firstly it's nice and green and adventurous, but it's also directly accessible from the houses. There's no street that's running between some of these houses and that space. A little square in the same area. This is a co-housing development that's won awards in Cambridge, and this is actually an alms house scheme. So it's social housing in another village outside Cambridge, and you can see just again not a springy chicken, but a green grassy area that children can naturally play in, ride around, and it's well overlooked from the housing. So, how do we get this to happen? I say a lot about this in my book, but I'm just going to pull out a couple of closing themes. So one is that we think about the building blocks, the physical components, the bits of the jigsaw puzzle that need to come together, and there are four. Streets, I hope it's clear now why they're at the top of this list. Walking cycling networks, public space and housing. And a good programme will be looking at each of those four elements. So I'm just going to say a little bit about streets and the kind of steps that make streets become places that are not dominated by cars, but where other good things can happen. Good things that children can do, but also good things for other people as well. So yes, tackling traffic, reducing or removing parked cars, reconfiguring parking, a green and sociable field. Everybody loves street trees, and in a warming city, trees have a phenomenal impact on the level of comfort in a street. Good walking routes, and I did have cycle lanes here, but we don't always need segregated cycle lanes. This is Orford Road in Walthamstow, where I live. It's like a little bit of Spain or Italy has arrived in my neighbourhood. It's shishi, there's pavement cafes spilling out, but it's also a place where, because for most of the week traffic is entirely restricted, people can walk, bike, or even use those wiggly skateboardy things that some young people like. And a kind of gateway to some of this is an emerging model that's being called a school street. Now, school street is where the street outside a school is close to traffic, maybe temporarily. This is what's happening here in Hackney. So for maybe an hour around the morning and then an hour in the afternoon, through traffic is stopped. And that's a way to encourage families and children to walk. Or maybe it's a permanent change to stop traffic in the street outside the school. And what we're seeing is countries and cities around the world are taking forward this model. There are now over 1,000 school streets. In fact, this is probably well out of date. And so that's a flavour of the kind of way in which you can start to build interventions progressively, changes in neighbourhoods that show people what it's like to be in a place that works better for children. And one of the reasons I'm most interested in this topic, I'm not a planner, but I don't think you need to be a planner to realise that cities are incredibly complex ecosystems, right? Fixing a city is not like treating a disease where you can come up with one nice treatment and then you can measure and you can see an outcome and you can no. Cities city planning is often known as a definitive wicked issue or a social mess. This is ideas going back 50 years that not everybody agrees what the problems are in the city. What is it we want to try and fix? People with different ideological views will have a different take. There's all sorts of different ways into fixing cities, political, monetary constraints. The effects of what you do in a city can often be unpredictable. And there is huge resistance to change. And that's even before we get into the kind of, let's just say, problematic public discourse that we now find ourselves in many democratic countries, where it's almost impossible to even set up a way to have a conversation about how we can improve economic or environmental or social or health outcomes, because discourse has become so polluted. So, one of the strongest, let's call it a selling point, I think, for thinking about children and bringing children into the conversation about urban planning and design is because it helps us to navigate this complexity, to build some kind of consensus. If we think about children, we're compelled to think about the longer term. Yes, I mean, it's self-evident. We're often thinking about children invites us to come up with collective responses, with responses that take us outside of our own terms, and also helps to challenge vested interests that can otherwise have a big say over what happens in cities. And actually the best example of all this is just at the other side of the Channel Tunnel, and get off the Eurostar, and if you've been to Paris recently, that's to say in the last 2 or 3 years, you'll see that city has been transformed by its current mayor, Anne Hidalgo. And Anne Hidalgo has made this vision of creating a more child and family friendly city absolutely central to all of the things that she's done. And it's an incredible list. I won't read through it, but this is from a standing start, okay? So 8-10 years ago, there was nothing, this was not even on the radar screen of people in Paris, which, let's remind ourselves, is a world city, like London, is one of the few cities that can claim to have a global profile. So I think that's a salutary lesson. But actually I want to come back. Oh, by the way, Paris recently, Olympics of course, but it's also just won the gold medal for a different competition, and that's the most child-friendly city. There's an NGO called Clean Cities, based here in the UK, looked at 40 different cities in Europe and ranked them according to their objective measures of child friendliness, and Paris was top of the list. But I want to close with a quote, not from Anne Hidalgo, but from this guy. So this is Chris Boardman. He, as you may know, was gold medal Olympic cyclist. He is the active travel commissioner for England. He is also the chair of Sport England, so he's a busy guy. And this is a quote that he's children be emotional in all of us. And he tells a story, and I'll just tell you the story he tells. So he explains how about 10 years ago, his then 12-year-old daughter, Aggie, asked him a question that changed his life. And the question she asked was, can we ride to the park? It wasn't the question that struck him, it was his answer, which was no. And he answered that question no, because he felt it was too dangerous. And the park in question was about 2 minutes away by bike. You can imagine, Chris Boardman would know that. He would have got out his, And it struck him as very wrong that he couldn't keep his daughter safe on a bike ride for 2 minutes. And so he decided to do something about it, and that was his route into this whole new world of planning and transport. And now he says he wants to make sure that when Aggie has children, and her children ask her if they can cycle to the park, they'll be able to say yes. And I think that's a perfect illustration of why I think thinking about children and embracing child-friendly urban planning and design is a prism for making cities better places. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tim. It was a really fascinating talk. We've already had quite a bit of audience interaction and participation, but now it's question time. I think we'll take the questions singly on this occasion, so if you could put up your hand and wait for the microphone. Thank you. Lady behind you, Jenny. Yeah.
That's all right, Paul.
Thank you so much for a fascinating talk. My question is brief. Dogs.
Right. As with so many things, I think you're getting a conflict or potential conflict between dogs and dog ownership and children, families. I think it's horses for courses. I think there are some contexts. So, how do we figure out how to share this limited asset that we have in cities, namely public space? Is that what you're getting at? Yes. And sometimes I think there might be, if you like, a call or a need for some kind of segregation. In other contexts, there'll be a need to figure out how the same space can be shared fairly, and that will be, in simple terms, it will be a combination of design and enforcement. And that might vary in different contexts with different populations and pressures. It's a tricky one, but then, as I hinted at earlier, so is noise, so is so-called antisocial behaviour. I think if you go into those sorts of topics looking for compromise and a fair settlement, then you can figure out a solution that works. If you go in wanting to have 100% happiness with everything, you will fail. Cities don't work like that. There's a wonderful quote by Jane Jacobs. I didn't mention Jane Jacobs, but any of you who have any interest in cities will be familiar with Jane Jacobs, 20th century's most important urbanist. And she talks that the fundamental of city living is that people have a degree of responsibility and care about each other, even when they don't know each other. So you figure out how to rub along in a city. And she then goes on to say, that's not something that you can teach, you learn it through the experience of having those sorts of encounters and interactions. And I think dogs is one example of where that happens. So what she's saying is, children are kind of inducted or organically, intuitively pick up, or at least part of what helps children appreciate what it means to be a citizen of the city. Part of that is through their own experience. She devotes a whole chapter of her book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, to children. Chapter 4. It's a beautiful chapter. So I'm commending to you. Sorry, that's a slight diversion. Thank you.
Next question.
Yeah, okay. You've made a great case for reducing traffic in the urban environment. I think it's unarguable. You did briefly refer to no traffic neighbourhoods. Whenever one of those is proposed, there's huge, noisy opposition, and it seems that some people just don't understand that traffic is dangerous and unwanted in residential areas. I don't know if you have any suggestions or solutions to this problem.
I'm glad you asked that question. I know it's an extremely controversial. It's one of those topics that's become horribly sucked into a kind of culture wars, which I'm not an active participant in, but I'm a very close observer of. In other words, I think, what can I say about? I think it's helpful to try and not necessarily use that phrase, but build a consensus with, if you like, a coalition of the willing about traffic. Yes, in a neighbourhood, say, what do we want our neighbourhood to be like in 5 or 10 or 15 years? What kind of steps do we want to make? And what do we know? Because there's lots of knowledge now, there's lots of hard data about the impact of different interventions. What do we know about what might get us in that direction? And I think almost everybody would say, yes, I would quite like to live in a neighbourhood that has less traffic, that has fewer cars, where cars move more slowly, and ideally where there are fewer of them. I don't think that's a culture war position. The position is how do you get from here to there, and how do you deal with the potential side effects. And that's the beginning of a healthy conversation, I think, about circulation in there. But one of the things I think is true is that, and this is a strong topic for me right now, is that it's very hard to appreciate just how deep our social kind of car-centric worldview is. It really is. I mean, let me just ask one question. So, how do you think it's kind of basically, you have a claim to have a parking space in your neighbourhood? I'm not going to ask you to show that. But pause for a minute and think, hang on a minute, why do we have a claim on a parking space? I don't have a claim on a storage space outside my house. If I had a cow, I wouldn't expect the council to provide a place to put my cow. This is an actual quote from a Spanish mayor who's actually taken out parking. In Tokyo and most other Japanese cities, if you want to buy a car, you have to prove to the authorities that you will have somewhere where you can park that car off of the street. Okay, so again, any of you who've ever been to Tokyo or any other big Japanese city, you will not see on-street parking. That's not just some kind of magic, nice thing that Japanese people do. It's a law, and that law was brought in 1965 because somebody smart in Japan realised back in the 60s that there were going to be huge problems in their cities if they didn't regulate the ownership of cars. So that's just one glimpse into the wonderful and terrifying world of what's sometimes called car brain, right? And I can probably guess that there's already some people feeling on it. My car matters. Yes, of course it matters. I own a car. We have grown up with 100 years of a society in which car ownership has become absolutely embedded in every aspect of our lives, where vast swathes of the country have been designed around the necessity of having a car. So unwinding that, even in cities that have good public transport and that are walkable, unwinding that is really difficult. And there will be some people who will lose out. I think that's another thing to say. I think one of the mistakes that some local authorities have made about low traffic neighbourhoods is sort of telling everybody that everybody will be better off, and it will be wonderful, it will be the new Jerusalem, and nobody will lose out. And that is not true. But of course it's obvious as well when you think about it. If there was an easy way to solve these problems that absolutely 100% of people always agreed with, I think we would have probably done it by now. So you're always dealing with trade-offs. You're always dealing with thinking about side effects, with who gains and who loses. And I think going into these conversations, these difficult conversations about how we make neighbours better, you do a better job if you're honest about the fact that not everybody will gain, but there might also be some short-term impact in terms of traffic changes, or people getting used to the fact that the routes that they used to drive very easily will now be harder, and. But the slightly longer answer to your question is, I think, let's make sure at least that the children, the people who are not often in these conversations about traffic are considered. Children, people who don't own a car, or have access to a car, and that often includes older people, of course, people who have lost or never had access to a car. And let's also look out for bad actors, because there is a lot of myth-making and misinformation about some of these topics that needs to be challenged. Thank you for that question.
Next question. Lady in the front there.
How can we promote children's participation in the design by citizens?
Children, so the question is, how can we involve children?
So I've got two questions.
I think
One is about voice and participation.
Yes.
How can we involve children and young people
Yeah.
so we get designs that work for them, they have unfettered minds, not so attached to the status quo. Second part is, there are big clinical mass rides that happen in London. How can those have more impact? They're incredibly joyful
Yes.
events, very powerful, but never covered by the mainstream media.
Okay, so the participation piece, I have a slightly nuanced take on participation. I think participation is a good thing, and we should be speaking to children and young people more, partly because, as you say, they often have great ideas and insights, particularly about what it's like to live in their neighbourhood. Children and young people can tell you where are the dodgy areas, why is it nobody's using that playground even though it's had a lot of money spent on it, where are the places that are difficult to cross. But I also think sometimes participation doesn't work very well. It can be tokenistic, it can be badly framed, it can become quite resource intensive. So you need to be smart, is my view, about how you involve children and people. And one of the ways in which you do that is by making sure that the adult decision makers hear from children, ideally directly. So you don't just write a report that gets sent to somebody and sits on the shelf. I've heard it talk about gathering digital dust. You don't want reports that gather digital dust. And so I'm interested in people who are actually bringing children and adult residents and decision makers, designers, in the same room, and maybe going through a process that allows for kind of proper engagement, listening and respect, and the building up of a kind of shared vision. What's the other question?
Critical mass.
Critical mass. I mean, it's one example of a set of kind of reclaiming public space type interventions that I just think are great, and they should be more. And in fact, in my part of London, I've kind of taken it as an action point to myself to find out what's happening in Waltham Forest about critical mass, play streets, street festivals. I think there's something about directly getting people to recognise the joy and the energy, and the slightly kind of way in which, when you have children visible and engaged in large numbers in a street or public space, that it slightly tilts the world on its axis. It is now, especially, it's actually slightly surprising. I remember a year or two ago being near London Bridge, and a critical mass event just rode past, and I happened to be there at the same time. It's like when you see a flock of parakeets flying over a park. It's kind of incredible. It's sort of spectacular. So I don't know how we get the media interested in that, but I think anybody in this room who thinks they can do something to get more of those events happening anywhere, I'd say go for it, because it's surprising what you can do if you just get, it's that Margaret Mead quote, isn't it, about not underestimating what a small group of people can do to change the world if they get together and work. So thank you for that reminder of group action.
I think we have time for just one more question. Yes.
I really loved your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are there any very specific thoughts as to town planning, street planning, all of that, in relation to teenagers. I know the definition of children, I don't know when that starts in teenage. But teenagers are not quite adults yet and also like to gather and...
Yes. So, firstly, I think, harking back to the previous question about engagement, there's an imperative. We really should be talking to teenagers about what might make neighbours work better and places where they might choose to spend time and gather. And there's also a cultural conversation about nurturing tolerance of that. Because I think it is pretty clear that there's quite large sections of the population who are hostile to the very idea of teenagers being in public space. In my book, I talk about a device called the mosquito. Don't know. So this is an electronic device that emits a high-pitched tone that is calibrated to be audible by people below a certain age, but inaudible by people above a certain age. Now, firstly, it's pretty scattergun. And the point is that it's a dispersal mechanism. So I was once with a group of teenage boys doing a walkabout in Hackney, and at the end of the walk we got to a McDonald's because they wanted to get a coffee. And half of them started covering their ears and retreating from the building. But half of them didn't. And that was because they split between the ones who could hear the mosquito, and it was really unpleasant, and the ones who could. Now, what kind of a message is that giving about the claim that those young people have, the legitimacy of their right to even just be in that place? So we have to tackle that, sometimes called child phobia or teen phobia. And then there are engagement ideas, and also a few, in my book I come up with a few ideas. Nature, sociable nature, so places that offer convivial seating but also shade and greenery is really good. Weirdly, swings are very popular with teens, especially teenage girls. There's a growing interest in teenage girls who are often doubly marginalised, because to the extent that teenagers get the attention, it's often teenage boys. Which means that the only thing you might see in a park that's supposed to be for teens is the cage, the kid kebab area, or the skate ramp. Now, cages and skate ramps have a place, but they will only be of interest to a minority of teens, and so let's raise our game, and certainly thinking about those other elements. But the most important message: don't hate on teenagers and speak to them about what they might like to see, because they've got pretty strong ideas and views.
So, thank you very much for the questions, and thank you especially to our speaker today, Tim Gill, who's given us such an interesting talk, which is obviously not just of interest to children, but to all of us. And as a new grandparent, I'm beginning to think about these issues more even than I did before. So, we have a little token of our appreciation to give to you.
Thank you so much. Oh, I see some foil on the top. Marvellous, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.